Well, good afternoon and welcome once again to CWI Media broadcasts, analysing the global pandemic, the global crisis of capitalism and struggles which have emerged around the world. And we'd like, as always, to begin by asking our viewers to go to our YouTube channel, that's CWI Media, and tick the subscribe box in the top right-hand corner. You don't have to pay anything to subscribe, but it nevertheless helps us boost our audiences. Now, of course, we've seen many movements taking place globally in the course of the last few weeks, but we've seen a particular outbreak of rioting and looting taken place in South Africa. And it's there that we're going to be concentrating our discussions today. We've seen incredible scenes of supermarkets being attacked, factories being burned down. It followed the imprisonment of the former president Zuma. And there's obviously a whole position of turmoil which has gripped the country. And today we're joined by members of the Marxist Workers' Party in South Africa, affiliates of the Committee for a Workers' International. We'll be joined by Comrade Sheri, Comrade Weizman, and of course Comrade Shaun as well. And we'd like to begin, before coming to discuss some of these developments, to remind our viewers they can pick up on our global analysis of the situation, news about South Africa, our analysis of South Africa and other countries on our website at socialistworld.net. But now let's turn to the question of South Africa itself. We have Zuma, the former ANC president, has been imprisoned. We have a desperate economic situation. As the last figure I saw, that officially the unemployment levels have reached 42%. And we have a catastrophic situation. But maybe we could begin with Sheri, if you could start off by outlining what is the background to the social and economic crisis which exists. What background does that form to these dramatic events that we've seen in the last week or so?
Thank you, Tony. Yes, we are still getting reports every day of the extent of the damage that in smaller towns that didn't reach the headlines. And just yesterday, we saw that the death toll had risen up to 276 people who've been killed. So, the situation obviously has, as you said correctly, that it's a number of factors have come together that caused this explosion. And I think the pandemic was really the accelerator that was used, and the release of, the arrest of Zuma was the match that lit this fire. So these factors that have been coming together and has been worsened by the pandemic, has to do with the fact that South Africa now, 25 years after, or a quarter of a century more than a quarter of a century since the dismantling of apartheid, is the most unequal country on the planet. That is, 67% of the wealth in this country belongs to just 1%. The unemployment levels, as you pointed out, nearly half the population is unemployed, and especially the youth, over 70% of them can't find work. So this is the situation that all these factors coming together with hardly any relief from government in terms of social relief packages with this latest wave of the pandemic. When the level 4 lockdown measures were introduced by the president on the eve of the unrest or the rioting and the looting, he made this announcement with no relief indicated for people that would be thrown out of work, for the destitute people who have been thrown out of work since the pandemic began, and I think that just angered the people all the more. So these socio-economic conditions really are expressed at every level of society, from health to education to the police services to all the kinds of services, including electricity, water supply. There's just been a general collapse of services inside the country that adds to the frustration levels where people are forced to find ways to connect themselves to electricity. They're forced to remove the rubbish themselves because it doesn't get collected. The police, the reason why they couldn't respond in time was because they don't have the resources themselves, because just this year's budget in terms of the police cutbacks amount to something like 11 billion rand that's been cut off the police budget. So, the police don't have vehicles. They don't, apparently they didn't have rubber bullets, to even try and prevent some of the looting. So this is the situation that we are facing. And with regard to health in particular, it's quite criminal what's happened, that in the middle of the worst pandemic, and South Africa's infection rate is the worst on the continent. With just last night, that the total number of infections was up again to 16,000 rand per day. 16,000, yeah, 16,000 rand per day, and it is expected that will probably increase because of the looting, that there was the looting and the burning, was a super spreader event for the infection numbers. And when you look at the vaccination, South Africa has only now vaccinated 10% of the population. This is compared to Zimbabwe, which people would say is already a failed state, where they've at least vaccinated 15% of the population. And these kinds of statistics at every level, from education, where international measures for literacy, for maths, South Africa is performing the worst on the continent. Countries where there are wars and so on are doing better when it comes to these kinds of indices. And the same with health, not just in terms of this pandemic, but also just generally in the kind of health outcomes of child mortality rates, especially children under 5 are performing very poorly in terms of health outcomes. So at all these levels, if you can look, there are just so many factors that have come together to bring about the kind of explosions, together with the fact, obviously, that it was orchestrated by people who, in the ruling party, the factions there, used the situation to mobilize, behind what they wanted to do, is to weaken, the Cyril Ramaphosa. But I suppose the other comrades will come in on that. So I will leave it at.
Well, thanks, Sheri. I mean, they're quite striking figures that you've given there. I mean, it's incredible. We have 67% of the wealth owned by 1%. The unemployment figures you gave them, as you say, 50% unemployed. It's staggering in terms of the social collapse which has taken place, and of course the health crisis now to boot on top of that. So maybe if we could move on, because of course we saw the incredible scenes of Zuma being imprisoned, the former president. There was then the movement by some of his supporters to try and release him, or protesting about his imprisonment. Then we've seen the outbursts of these riots. So what really is the link between the two, if there is one? And what's involved in the rioting? Is it just an outpouring of anger and bitterness and desperation? Or behind it is more than that? And maybe Weizman would like to comment on that, as he's moved in front of his camera now to illuminate some of those points. So Weizman.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tony. Yeah, I think that Sheri has outlined graphically the social disaster which has been prepared by the ANC government's neoliberal economic policies, particularly since they adopted a program called the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy in 1996. One of the ironies of this particular situation, incidentally, is that the intensification of the neoliberal assault on the working class actually began under the Zuma presidency. So it is Zuma's presidency after the global financial crisis in 2008. Zuma acceded to the presidency in 2009 that saw eye-watering cuts in budgets for social spending inside the country. So that the faction that Zuma represents, that goes under the title Radical Economic Transformation, is as responsible for the social disaster as the Ramaphosa faction itself. And I think it is important for us to disentangle the intersecting social processes and political processes that have produced the events of the past week. In a sense, the ANC government merely supplied the inflammable raw material which the Radical Economic Transformation faction of the ANC has exploited for its own purposes. The consensus within society, of course, is that it is the social conditions, unbearable social conditions that the masses are under, that made it possible for these explosive events to occur. But we have a duty as socialists to take account of all the interlocking factors that coincided, that made it possible for the actual explosion to take place. And it is around the factional divisions within the ANC on the basis of which Zuma first came to power after the ANC's conference in 2007, that prepared the foundations for the factional civil war that has now broken out within the ANC. The deterioration in the economic situation has been opportunistically seized by the Zuma faction, the Radical Economic Transformation faction, in order to deflect attention from their co-responsibility for the social disaster facing the masses inside the country, and has resulted in them attempting to secure a base for themselves amongst the most marginalized, the most destitute, the declassed, and even to rely on the lumpenized elements, organized criminal gangs, to be able to bring about the events of the last week. So we need to separate the response of the masses who are hungry, who have no access to resources, no access to basic commodities for their day-to-day existence, who poured through the doors of the malls and the shopping centers opened in an orchestrated way by the Radical Economic Transformation faction, and who relied on basis of support for these type of actions that have been prepared over the years. And the context for the timing of these events was the imprisonment of Zuma for contempt of court for refusing to appear before the Commission of Inquiry into what is called state capture, in reality a Commission of Inquiry into corruption, in which Zuma himself played a critical role. It is his imprisonment that conveyed a sense to the faction that he is the spiritual father of, that they had suffered a significant defeat with his imprisonment. And this represented an attempt on their part to reverse the setbacks that they had suffered and to prepare the basis, possibly for a comeback within the ANC in the National General Council, the highest decision-making body in between ANC conferences, that is actually supposed to take place this year, but may not as a result of the lockdown, and the conference that is supposed to take place next year. They wanted to portray Ramaphosa as weak, as ineffectual, and to contribute towards the decline of his standing within society as a whole, because Ramaphosa regularly outpolls his own organization and is in that sense the individual responsible for maintaining the ANC at the level that it has in the context of a general decline in its electoral support. So this was clearly a case of the radical economic transformation detonating the explosion that was inherent in the situation, but went a great deal further than that. It is not possible for what has transpired alongside the looting of the shopping centers and the malls to explain the attacks on infrastructure, the snarling up of the major highway linking Durban to Johannesburg, the sabotage of radio stations, clinics, pharmacies, as well as vaccination centers and blood donor centers. That cannot be explained on the basis of the actions of the masses who went to help themselves to food and basic commodities in the shopping centers. These actions were orchestrated by these forces, the radical economic transformation forces, for entirely ulterior motives, and that is to try and arrest the decline of their factional position within the ANC and to try and put it into reverse. So it is, in other words, the intersection between the legitimate discontent of the masses as a result of the searing poverty into which they've been plunged by the capitalist policies of the ANC government, and the grievances of the radical economic transformation faction over the reverses that they've signed. There's no fundamental difference between these two factions. They are all equally committed to the neoliberal policies, as I indicated. The intensification of these policies began under the Zuma administration. But the main difference is really that the looting on which, in fact, the post-apartheid order was based, the massive transfer of wealth that commenced with the implementation of GAIR in 1996, is really the equivalent
Okay, Weizman, well, I think you're frozen there, but maybe
what the radical economic, the forces that they represent have not succeeded in enriching themselves as much as they had expected to.
no.
If we look at for example, the shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, there's only one black company in the top 100 of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and it is the basis for the bitter frustrations of a section of the black capitalist class that they have not made it and have attempted to overcome the limitations to the possibility of self-enrichment to open corruption.
Okay, well, that's quite illuminating there, Weizman, in terms of what forces are involved in this and what Zuma and Ramaphosa really represent. Now, if we can maybe turn to Shaun, because we have Ramaphosa as the president. He probably thought, with the imprisonment of Zuma, that would resolve all of the issues in terms of the dispute between the two factions. It's a bit of a miscalculation, to say the least, in terms of what's transpired since. But maybe, Shaun, you could outline in a bit more detail what is represented between these, by these two different factions within the ANC itself, between the Zuma wing and the Ramaphosa wing, and how is the ANC now perceived? I mean, what is the effect of all of this in terms of the standing of the ANC, which after all at one stage was seen as the main liberation movement in South Africa in the struggle against apartheid? And what's the situation now as far as the perception, the support of the ANC at this stage?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I mean, I think I'll pick up firstly on the point you made in beginning the question, is that certainly the Ramaphosa faction breathed a sigh of relief for a few days between the jailing of Zuma, or him handing himself into the police, and it becoming apparent that the violence was going to spread. And we could say, in a sense, that on the plane of the democratic constitution in South Africa, on the plane of normal bourgeois politics, if you like, that the Zuma faction had been defeated. But of course, that didn't exhaust the question. It revealed that the Zuma faction had other layers in society to call upon, more shadowy, more sinister forces, as Weizman outlined. So in answering the question, maybe the next point I'll make, especially for an international audience, is in terms of what the different factions represent, is to make the point that the ANC enjoys an overwhelming political dominance, or it has done. It's on the decline, and I'll explain that. But its dominant position means that the factional struggles of the classes in society, the factional struggles within the ruling class, the struggles between the conflicting interests within the middle class, and even by extension, the working class, because of the alliance between one of the biggest trade union federation and the ANC, means that all of the contradictions between the classes in South African society are reflected in the factional politics of the ANC. And so in that sense, what the Cyril Ramaphosa faction represents is, and of course there's always nuances and nothing is chemically pure, as we always say, but overwhelmingly, the Cyril Ramaphosa faction represents the interests of the monopolies in South Africa, the mining monopolies in particular, the banks, and the established capitalist class, historically white, but as Weizman pointed out, still overwhelmingly white, protected and developed, incubated by the apartheid state historically. And overwhelmingly, the Ramaphosa faction represents those interests. And the program that they're pursuing in government, and Weizman's right, of course, that the Zuma government, in terms of its overarching economic policy, was no different. But the Ramaphosa faction now is pushing ahead with those with policies in those interests. So we've got a strict commitment to reduction in public spending. Under the pressure of the ratings agencies and the growing government debt, we don't have more time to go into those points, but cutting back government spending and pursuing a policy of privatisation in the still large state-owned sector in South Africa. Just small examples are the part privatisation of the state airline in recent months, with a 50% stake being sold to a private consortium, a black-owned one. The government is proud to announce. The breaking up of the state electricity provider as clear preparation for future privatisation, and a similar development in the state freight company, rail freight, preparing the breaking up of that. Now, the Zuma faction, whilst going along with this overarching policy, has attempted, or rather represents the interests of, and during the presidency attempted to push this approach more, the interests of the frustrated aspirant black middle class, aspirant black bourgeoisie capitalist class, that attempts to use the state in a more decisive way to make greater inroads into the monopolies in terms of black ownership, but especially to use the state through the system of tenders, of outsourcing, of the huge procurement budgets, in order to enrich a layer and allow them to compete or take their place alongside the historically white capitalist class. But of course, the problem in the neo-colonial world in general but South Africa especially, is that the huge inequality that Sheri described, for example, means that the aspirant black bourgeoisie is too weak and too small. It's arrived too late on the scene of history to have any hope of competing against the established monopolies, which are supported by the links to the imperialist countries, the big mining houses, and so on. And so what developed under the Zuma presidency was these policies of corruption, like Weizman referred to, of state capture, of if you can't get the wealth through legal means, then just take it in any case. Ultimately, two factions represent this faction of struggle within the ruling class in South Africa. Just the last few points then on the implications of this and the standing of the ANC is to make the point that despite its historic dominance in the last period, the ANC is on a steady decline electorally and especially amongst the working class. Overwhelmingly, millions of especially the poor, the unemployed, and more layers of the working class refuse to give it any support. But at this stage, because of the vacuum, which will develop later in the broadcast, that manifests itself as low voter turnouts. And so what's posed is the question, of course, can the ANC fall below 50%, which would force it to try and make a coalition with some of the opposition parties, which opens up a more fractious position for the ruling class in terms of their attempt to manage and stay on top of the class divisions in society. But also, of course, the question of a split in the ANC. And very interestingly, and I'll finish on this point, Financial Times, which is, of course, an international newspaper, thought the situation in South Africa was significant enough to dedicate an editorial to in a recent edition. And they've put the position, pushing that Ramaphosa should go for a split, that he should try and cut away this dead wood, that he's able to, his faction is able to more decisively seize control of the situation and push forward a program in the interests of the monopolies and imperialism. But of course, making that advice and the capacity of the Ramaphosa faction to do that is an entirely different question, which will play out in the months ahead.
Well, there's some very interesting points there, Shaun, that you've raised, both in terms of the details of the ANC and the different factions, but what's really happening amongst the different wings of the ruling class, the capitalist class, and the aspiring capitalist class as well. But just before we move on, I'd like to encourage all of our viewers, go to our website, that's at socialistworld.net, where you'll find more in-depth analysis. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can like our page on Facebook at Socialist World-CWI, and you can follow us on Instagram at Socialist World. But as a response to these riots and the looting which has taken place, there's also been reports of quite significant movements within the community of self-defense groups, of community coming forward to stop this rioting plunging into just a disintegration. So I don't know, Sheri, if you would have any comments on that or could elaborate on that, about how significant these movements are and what they potentially could mean for the development of the movement in the next period.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, in the area where I live, the community members decided on, when the looting just began, to organize themselves into patrols around shopping malls and also in the street where we live, which faces an area where there are factories, where there was some looting and burning. The community patrolled in this area in order to ensure that it didn't spill over into the residential area. So there was a lot of spontaneous, reaction when people realized that the police were simply not going to come. Many people had called the police, but they didn't respond. And so they had to take, matters into their own hands. But there are reports, of some
Sheri, I think we've broken up there a little bit. If we just bear with us a little bit, we'll see if we can get you back, Sheri, because this is an important point. Oh, you there? Okay. No, well, maybe in that case, Shaun, I don't know if you're able to join us again. Are you? No. Okay, well, we'll come back to that issue of the community developments, the movements that have taken place, where there has been a reaction from some sections of the local community to try and intervene and stop the worst of the looting and the rioting which has taken place. So if you just bear with us, we're trying to get some of viewers back, and then we'll explore further the question of these community movements which have taken place. And hopefully also we can move on to look at the question of how the trade unions have responded to this crisis and what future developments we can possibly see there. So we're just trying to re-establish the connection with the comrades from South Africa, and then we can try and develop some of those points a lot further in a more in-depth manner. And I should just say, of course, as usual, to our viewers, if you go to our YouTube channel on CWI Media, subscribe there. We can help us. You can assist us in boosting our viewing numbers. And of course, as usual, we'd like your financial support. You could go to our webpage at socialistworld.net and make a donation to help the Committee for Workers International in its work in the course of the next period. So I think now we're able to return to Sheri. Yes, we're back to Sheri. Okay, very good. So maybe you could continue with the points that you were, very important points you were developing on the question of the community movements which have taken place. We got Sheri back visually. We're having a problem with a little bit of the sound, I think, here. I don't know. Maybe, Sheri, have you muted? Are you muted? No?
No, I'm not muted.
No, you're
Must I
back now.
mute
Okay, we
myself?
got you back. Okay, go. The floor's yours. Okay, Sheri.
Sorry, I'm muted. Did you want me to come back on this?
No, carry on from where you left off on the community movements. Yeah.
Yes. No, I was saying that, in terms of the specific interventions that our party is trying to make around building on these self-defense committees that have been established, I was asking Shaun to come in on that because he's just fresh from a visit to one of those communities where there is a more established structure and where, there's quite a high level of organization. And we are hoping that, we could connect up with this community to see how we can extend that kind of work into other communities in terms of building a larger civic movement out of that. Because, that is one of the problems, is that there isn't an organized, progressive group of people to speak on the kind of issues that that are worrying communities, and they are falling prey to the kind of nationalist, racist, xenophobic messages that these forces of the radical economic transformation are spewing. So we need to build a kind of an alternative, and it begins by doing this work on the ground where people are already beginning to organize.
Yeah, well, that's important. And maybe Shaun could elaborate on that, as he's had some experience recently in intervening or visiting some of these movements that have taken place in the communities. So Shaun, maybe you could touch upon that and also develop a point which I think is important. Is what has been the response of the trade unions during the course of this crisis? What position has SAFTU, NUMSA and the other trade union confederations brought forward? And linked to that, you referred earlier to the question of the demise of the ANC, the question of a new Workers' Party, which has been on the agenda for debate for years now in NUMSA and around some of the trade unions. And what is the current situation there, and what's the prospects of any movement in that direction as a consequence of this crisis? if you're there. Sir.
Thanks, Tony. I think we just had the counter-revolutionary technical gremlins there, because Comrade Sheri had explained about the self-defense that had developed in the township where she and Comrade Weizman live, and how that had been organized by ordinary community members. But that's correct. We've attempted to go into other areas to discuss with that layer of the working class that has come together, that has mobilized and organized to try and defend their communities against the looting and the loss of life that's developed. And yesterday we went to an area called Katlehong. It's in the Ekurhuleni municipality in Gauteng. Now, we were put onto the trail by a very good newspaper article, which was published online on Sunday, which describes how the community had come together, organized more than 200 of themselves to act as patrols, picket lines to defend the mall in particular. But also when we got there on the ground, it was clear that the roads that were not main thoroughfares had been barricaded as well, so there was no reason for anyone to go down them unless they were residents of that particular street. And we were able to meet the organisers of this initiative, and it's revealed a whole number of the best traditions of the working class, really, because the key element, of course, that has allowed so much of this chaos to develop is the huge vacuum that exists, which I'll come back to in a moment. But what was different about the Katlehong township, or at least Zone 3, the area where this organisation had been set up, was that these organised working class forces had stepped into the vacuum. And the consequence was that the mall was saved, the jobs were saved, there was no destruction. But the initiative had its roots in the previous year, because it's difficult to improvise something in the middle of a crisis. But what had been formed by the community in the year before was a community watch program, just a handful of residents organising as a supplement to the police, to patrol the area, to keep an eye on hotspots, of muggings and so on, house breakings and so on. And the initiative grew out of that. So when the reports started to come through that looting, vandalisation, burning down of premises was taking place, when the news came through that the malls in the area were being destroyed, the residents organised around that community watch programme put the call out to the community. Up to 200 volunteered to defend the community. But then they were backed up by older residents, by women, largely men that took part in the defence, who provide hot drinks, food, to raise donations, to supply the defenders. And really, for us, that's the key thing. We've raised the demand, especially. I think the broadcast cut when Sheri made these points, but there's a danger of intertribal and interracial conflict in the way that community organisation can be organised, that it can lend itself to tensions, but that the organisers of this initiative had in fact organised it on a conscious basis against that. They mentioned how in the previous year they'd played a role in defending foreign residents in the township to prevent xenophobic attacks that were attempts to incite it, probably in hindsight linked to the same forces that have instigated the rioting, as they've been behind much of the xenophobic violence that regularly recurs. And so it was an absolutely excellent initiative. And we've opened up a discussion with those comrades in that community about the way forward, about the idea of building mass democratic community organisations and attempting to link them up on a wider basis. I can move on to the question of the trade unions. And the first point, again, to make there is the question of the vacuum, because what Katlehong shows is the vacuum did not need to exist, that working class communities with a bit of leadership, with a bit of organisation, can be mobilised and organised. And the reality is that overwhelmingly and unfortunately, the trade union leaderships have not really moved to try and fill the vacuum, to act as an antidote to the sinister forces that have moved in. For example, the call should have been put out when it became apparent that communities, a whole number of communities, the initiative I've just described is just one of many that has taken place. The call should have been put out by the trade union leaders for shop stewards to take part in these initiatives where they haven't begun, to be the ones to initiate them, and to bring the organised working class into those initiatives in a more decisive way. Now, the question of the Workers' Party is, again, that's the crucial question, the vacuum. If you pose the question of the political vacuum that exists in the communities, then you're posing the question of what you fill it with. What's the alternative? And for a long time, the CWI in South Africa has raised the demand for a new mass workers' party to be created. The trade unions have got the social weight to initiate it, and especially over the last, since the Marikana massacre of 2012, the question has been posed anew, and it's a constant debate in the workers' movement. But unfortunately, action on the question of the Workers' Party always seems to be just around the corner. And it's because every time it is posed as a more immediate development, the trade union leaderships pull back from it, always at the 1 minute to midnight, pull back from acting decisively on the question and divert the movement into different areas. Now, in the midst of the pandemic, at the start of this year in particular, the issue was beginning to be posed again. The Working Class Summit, which was an organisation or a conference that took place in 2018, initiated by the South African Federation of Trade Unions. This is the federation that was created out of the splits of the ANC-aligned COSATU around the question of their position on the Marikana massacre, in particular. And it began to be discussed. That summit agreed with SAFTU's decision that a Workers' Party should be launched. But then it fell off the agenda. And it's 3 years. This month is the 3-year anniversary of that 2018 summit. There's been very little action in the meantime. Try and finish on these on these points of where the process is at. But at the start of the year, the process began to move forward again. The question of not if we're going to launch a party, but when we're going to launch a party. Now, the Marxist Workers' Party, as part of the Working Class Summit steering committee and leadership, was part of the team assigned to draft a discussion paper outlining how we could move forward with the creation of a Workers' Party. Unfortunately, the reality is that the left around the Working Class Summit left us on our own, left us isolated, in reality refused to collaborate on the preparation of that paper, raising criticisms and complaints only after it had been submitted, despite the fact that they were supposed to be part of the process. And now that paper is being lost, being attacked politically from different angles. One of the obstacles on the road to a Workers' Party is the sectarian creation of a new small Stalinist party by the leadership of the Metal Workers Union, which doesn't really have much support amongst their own membership. And they have been posing that SAFTU should simply rally behind that party. And they have gone so far as, in some instances, to suppress debate on the paper that has been drafted by the Marxist Workers' Party. We raise that the new party must be broad, must be democratic, must be inclusive, there must be space for different political tendencies. But that is being rejected by the Stalinist elements in SAFTU. So the current position is that the paper has still not been debated. It's not clear even when a reconvened Working Class Summit will go ahead. But what we're pushing for and what we're campaigning for is, one, to ensure that a democratic debate takes place on our proposals for a Workers' Party, and two, that fresh forces are brought into the process. Because really, especially under the blows of the pandemic, or the pressure of the pandemic, the forces around the Working Class Summit have shrunk. And it's overwhelmingly, well, not overwhelmingly, but the most vocal elements that are left is the more petty bourgeois elements linked to the NGOs and the charities and so on, who have no real interest in pushing forward with working class power in reality. And so to bring fresh working class forces, some of which could have been generated by the events of the riots, as the Pat Lehong community defenders shows, to bring fresh elements into the process and push forward with it in that way.
Okay, well, thanks, Shaun. I think you've given a very illuminating report of some of the processes that are going on there. So we've had a very good airing of the recent developments and what lies behind them, and the crisis which is opening up inside South Africa. And maybe Weizman could draw our discussion today to a conclusion by outlining maybe what he views as some of the perspectives now for the state, for South African democracy, for the ruling class, and most importantly for the prospects for the working class and the question of building support for socialism and the socialist alternative in the coming period. So Weizman, maybe you could draw our discussions today to a conclusion.
Thank you, Comrade Tony. I think maybe to commence the summary of the discussion, I think it's necessary to make the point that what these events have demonstrated is that politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And the paralysis, particularly on the side of the organized labor movement and the left in general, has created the conditions where it has been possible for reactionary elements to take advantage of the position, to try and establish a social base for themselves amongst the most downtrodden, marginalized sections of the population. And the call that we are making as the Marxist Workers' Party is that in reality, what these events have revealed is the collapse of the influence that the workers' movement used to exercise over the entire working class, but in the period of its ascendancy in the struggle against apartheid. The then Congress of South African Trade Unions, notwithstanding the fact that it was already politically imprisoned within the tripartite alliance, was regularly able to mobilize many more millions under its banner in the struggle against apartheid than its actual membership. As a result of the turn to the right by the COSATU leadership, the link between organized labor and the rest of the community has been all but severed. And the trade union federations are standing before these developments disoriented, bewildered, and their positions determined by this confusion. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, for example, which has now gone over hook, line, and sinker to the side of capital, having first of all supported Ramaphosa's ascendancy to the presidency of the ANC by giving him their full support, notwithstanding the role that Ramaphosa played in creating the climate for the Marikana massacre by denouncing the strike of the mine workers at that time as a criminal act that should be dealt with concomitantly in that famous or infamous phrase of his. But they've also supported amendments to the Labor Relations Act that are calculated to cripple the right to strike, to cripple the ability to picket at strikes. And in addition to that, gives the state the right in the final analysis even to declare a strike illegal, even if all the onerous requirements now needing to be complied with to make a strike legal or protected in South African legal language have been met. And that is why we've seen that on the part of COSATU, all that there has been is a condemnation of the looting. On the side of the new federation, brought into existence in the wake of the developments around the Marikana massacre, in the expectation by those that drove its birth, that it would resuscitate the best of the traditions of the workers' movement in the struggle against apartheid, have been bitterly disappointed. On the one hand, the spokesperson of the new federation has been allowed to publish an article in a daily newspaper in which the confusion and disorientation of the left is fully revealed, who approach the looting almost as if it is something to celebrate, unable to distinguish between what is progressive and what is reactionary in all these developments, and are focusing all their attention, that is the left as a whole, on the demand for a basic income grant in circumstances where the social grants have not been extended, have not even been reintroduced under new lockdown as they were under the initial more stringent lockdown that was imposed last year. With both federations disoriented, unable to provide leadership, you have created a situation has been created where reactionary forces are able to engage in a battle for the allegiance of the working class as a whole. And we are calling upon the organized labor movement to utilize the current dispute between particularly the public sector workers and the government, which has carried out the biggest attack on the public sector workers since 1994, by not only refusing to implement a wage increase, the third leg of a wage increase agreed 3 years ago, but are now putting on the table, in effect, a 0% increase for the next 3 years. It has enraged the public sector workers. And the argument that we have put forward as the Marxist Workers' Party is that this is the perfect opportunity, not only to bring together the entire public service, not limited to those working in provincial and national government, but also local government and the state-owned enterprises in what could potentially be the biggest general strike, at least since 2010, which could simultaneously serve the purpose if the organized labor movement put on their agenda not only the wage demands, the demands for the filling of vacant posts, but also for a reversal of all the savage cuts that have been implemented by this government. Just to go back to what we had pointed out earlier, under this pandemic, not only did they cut the health budget, the education budget, the infrastructure budget, but they actually reduced corporate tax by a further 1%, to bring it now to less than half of what it was just before the ANC came to power in 1994, in a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. The government's cold indifference in relation to the implementation, even a resuscitation of the pitiful grants that they introduced very briefly during the first lockdown, shows a cold-blooded indifference about the consequences of their actions. As we speak at the moment, for example, the soldiers who came after the event in reality, in response to the riots, are now going into working class homes, confiscating goods that had been stolen, including food, and destroying it. This is causing further rage amongst working class people across the board. And if Ramaphosa had believed that the imprisonment of Zuma, following the suspension of the Secretary General before that, had given him a decisive grip in the factional battle over his opponents, he's clearly seriously mistaken. In the wake of these developments, the divisions that are normally only evident after the fact have played themselves out within the Ramaphosa faction in public over the past 2 days. The Minister of Police, for example, has rejected claims by the intelligence minister that they had received an intelligence report. The president himself has contradicted the defense minister over whether this was an insurrection or whether it was a counter-revolution. It is clear that there is disarray. Such hopes that Ramaphosa may have had that he could restore some kind of decisive grip and unify the ANC more strongly on his side are clearly not on the table. The perspective, therefore, that has opened up for the ANC is now that there will be potentially a split. But whether it splits or not, there will be a reduced vote for the ANC if it fails to split, if it still keeps the radical economic transformation so openly associated with corruption within the ranks of the party. We therefore have the possibility of a coalition government that could consist of either the whole ANC or a rump of it, and the openly pro-capitalist opposition Democratic Alliance, and even possibly the radical posturers of the Economic Freedom Front, whose leader would be quite happy to accept a cabinet position in what will be presented to society as a government of national unity to try and unify the country and to prevent it from collapsing. So, comrades, in conclusion, the conditions have never been better for the question of a workers' party to be placed front and center as posed not only by a public sector general strike, which could easily develop into a full-blown general strike, given that the private sector bosses taking their cue from the government are offering similarly provocative settlements in the wages in the private sector. And that could offer the opportunity for the working class to reclaim the allegiance of the marginalized, of the poor, of the unemployed, and unite the working class in a struggle for the overthrow of capitalism. Several opportunities have been missed. This opportunity, we are arguing as the Marxist Workers' Party, should not. And that could pose the possibility of a Workers' Party emerging in the next elections, if it were to be launched now, at least as the biggest opposition party to engage with the ANC government in battle in the next period. Thank you, comrade.
Okay, well, thanks, Weizman, for giving a very concise and very clear explanation as to the whole processes which will work, the exciting, explosive situation which is currently unfolding. So I think we've had a very rich and informative discussion today. So I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. I'd like to thank Sheri, Weizman and Shaun for participating and joining us from South Africa. Once again, we ask our viewers to support our website at socialistworld.net, where you can make a donation to the CWI. If you're not a member of the Committee for Workers International in any country, you can there apply to join. You can contact us and we'll get back to you and make sure you're fully organised and integrated into the activity that we're undertaking. We'd appeal to you again to follow us on our YouTube channel at CWI Media. And I'd just like to say in conclusion that this will be the last broadcast from the CWI Media channel for the summer. We're taking a break over the August period and we'll be back in September with further analysis and discussions about the crucial events which are unfolding internationally. So we hope to see you then. And in the meantime, we appeal to you to stay safe, keep up the struggle for a socialist world to replace this decadent, degenerating system of capitalism. So thanks very much, comrades.